feels like everyone's on edge these days, you know, like climate disasters and all the global tension. It's making even historically peaceful countries like Sweden think about, well, getting ready for anything.
Yeah.
And that's actually what we're diving into today.
Right.
This guide that the Swedish government sent to every single household in Sweden.
Wow.
On what to do if things go really bad.
Really? To every household?
Yeah.
Wow.
So we're going to be unpacking their approach to crisis and war preparedness.
Okay. It's a fascinating document.
Yeah.
It really walks you through everything, like potential threats, how Sweden's defense system works, even like very specific instructions for things like how to find shelter, or even like basic first aid.
It is intense. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
But it's also, I think, kind of a peek behind the curtain of how another country handles these really heavy topics.
Right.
And who knows, maybe we'll even learn a thing or two for ourselves in the process, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So what stands out to you as like the most important stuff in this brochure?
Well, the first thing that struck me was just how they frame the current global situation.
Okay.
They're not shying away from the fact that we live in kind of uncertain times.
Right.
And they're very clearly outlining all the potential threats, everything from armed conflict and cyber attacks to things like disinformation campaigns, extreme weather and pandemics, the whole gamut.
It's interesting. It's not just about like every man for himself, individual survival, right?
Right, not at all.
They're really pushing this idea of collective resilience, that everyone has a role to play in keeping the country safe.
Right, exactly. They're calling for individuals to step up.
Okay.
So join volunteer organizations, learn CPR, donate blood.
Wow.
Even just like talking to your neighbors about preparedness. They see all of that as contributing to national security.
So it's like fostering that sense of community and mutual support.
Right.
Which you would think would be pretty crucial.
Absolutely.
If things really went bad.
Yeah.
So how does this tie into Sweden's actual defense system?
Okay, so
They call it total defense.
total defense, yeah. And it's built on two pillars, military and civil.
Okay.
The military side is obviously about, protecting the country from armed attacks.
Right.
Which is especially interesting now that they've joined NATO.
Yeah, that's a pretty big move, I think, for a historically neutral country.
Huge.
How do you see that impacting their defense strategy overall?
Well, it's a major shift because now an attack on one NATO member is considered an attack on all.
Right.
So Sweden is automatically part of this much larger defense network.
That makes sense.
So yeah, it's a clear sign of the changing times that even a country like Sweden sees the need for this kind of collective security arrangement.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And then on the civil side, what's the focus there?
So civil defense is all about ensuring that essential services can keep running even during a war. So things like healthcare, energy, transportation.
Right.
Basically keeping society functioning as well as it can.
So it's not just about military might. It's about the whole ecosystem of a nation.
The whole thing.
Being able to withstand, like, a major shock.
Right, exactly.
They don't just stop at explaining the system, though. They go a step further.
Right.
And they talk about this heightened state of alert, right?
Yeah, yeah. And this is where I think the brochure gets particularly interesting.
Okay.
So this heightened state basically means that the government sees the risk of something like war as more serious. And they're getting ready to ramp up the country's defenses.
So what would that actually mean for, like, everyday Swedes?
Well, it could involve things like people being called upon to serve in specific roles based on their skills and training.
Go.
Maybe new regulations and restrictions come into play. And then there's the emergency alarm system.
That's the part that really, like, that caught my eye. They've got this specific signal for the highest state of alert, right?
They do.
Makes the hair on my arm stand up just thinking about it.
Yeah, it's definitely meant to get your attention.
Yeah.
It's a siren that goes off for 30 seconds, 15 seconds of silence, repeats for 5 minutes.
Okay.
And basically it means that the country is at war or under imminent attack.
Wow, so that's not a drill. That's the real deal.
That's the real deal.
And that leads us to the concept of total defense duty.
Right.
Which applies to all Swedish citizens between 16 and 70.
Even if they're living abroad.
So even if you're halfway around the world, you're still considered...
You're still part of Sweden's defense force, yeah.
Wow, that's commitment.
Serious commitment.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And they break it down into two main types of service.
Okay.
So there's Military or civil defense service.
Okay.
Where if the alert goes out, you report to your designated wartime post.
Okay.
Maybe serving in the armed forces or working in a hospital.
So that's having your specific assignment ready to go.
Exactly, yeah.
And then, okay, so that's one. And then there's...
General National Service.
Okay.
Which is a bit broader.
Okay.
So if that's activated, people are expected to remain at their jobs or support the total defense system in other ways, even if it's not directly related to the military.
Okay, so it sounds like the idea is that everyone has some way to contribute.
Everyone's got something to do.
Even if it's just keeping the essential parts of society running.
Exactly, yeah.
Let's go back to the siren signals for a second.
Okay.
They've got this whole system for different emergencies.
You've got a whole, Sweden's warning sirens are very sophisticated.
Yeah.
They test them regularly.
Yeah.
So that people know what to listen for.
Wow.
For example, they've got this thing called the Public Service Announcement Siren, or PSA.
Okay.
Which is 7 seconds of sound, 14 seconds of silence, and that repeats for 2 minutes.
And what's that one all about?
It's basically a heads up that something's going on.
Okay.
And you need to get more information.
Okay.
So go inside, close up your house, and tune in to their public radio channel, P4.
Okay.
It could be for things like hazardous air, fires, anything posing a risk.
So it's like, okay, something's up, pay attention.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then you've got the emergency alarm, which is the one we talked about earlier, for the highest state of alert. Then there's the air raid warning, which is a series of short bursts for 1 minute.
Okay.
And then there's the all clear, which is one long siren for 30 seconds.
Wow. They really haven't messed around when it comes to warning people, have they?
Not at all.
So if that air raid siren goes off, you need to take cover immediately.
Immediately, yeah.
They recommend finding a civil defense shelter, if at all possible.
Right.
And these shelters are designed for all sorts of threats, right?
Yeah, everything from shockwaves and bomb fragments to radiation and even chemical or biological weapons.
Wow.
They're meant to be pretty robust.
And how do you know where to find one?
Okay, so...
Are you assigned to a specific shelter or...
Nope, you just go to the one closest to you.
Yeah.
And there's actually a map of all the shelters online.
That is so handy.
It is.
So you're not scrambling around in a panic.
Right.
Trying to find a place to go.
Exactly, yeah. And these shelters have water, basic toilet facilities.
Okay.
And they can actually be used for other purposes in peacetime. But they have to be ready to go within 48 hours if there's an emergency.
Wow, that's smart.
Yeah.
So now I'm curious, what do they recommend that people have at home in case they have to hunker down in one of these shelters?
Okay, so they actually have a whole section on home preparedness.
Okay.
And it's incredibly detailed.
Okay.
The general advice is to be able to manage on your own for at least a week.
That seems like a solid rule of thumb, really, for any kind of emergency.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they emphasize that water is the most important thing.
Water, of course.
At least 3 liters per person per day.
Okay, so that's a lot of water.
It is.
What if you don't have space to store all that?
Well, they actually recommend filling plastic bottles and freezing them.
Oh, smart.
Yeah, that way they can double as ice packs if the power goes out.
Right.
And then you can drink the water as it melts.
That's clever.
Yeah.
Now, what about food?
So food, they recommend stocking up on non-perishable items.
Okay.
That are high in protein and fat.
Okay.
Things like grains, canned goods, dried meat, nuts, peanut butter.
So it's things that are really going to keep you full.
Full and energized, keep you going.
Yeah. And it's not just about bare bones survival.
Yeah.
Thinking about morale, too.
They are. And they even suggest having energy-boosting snacks on hand, too.
Oh, okay. Like what?
Like chocolate or dried fruit.
Makes sense. Little treats.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they also stress the importance of having warm clothing, blankets, sleeping bags, especially in winter.
Makes sense.
When temperatures can really plummet.
What if the power goes out? What do they recommend for staying warm?
Okay, so they suggest having alternative heat sources that don't rely on electricity.
Okay.
Things like gas or paraffin heaters, candles, matches, and fire starters.
Okay.
Of course, they also stress using those safely.
Of course, safety first. Always.
Absolutely.
Now, what about staying informed?
Okay, so...
How do they recommend that people stay connected if something happens?
So they emphasize having a battery-powered or hand-crank radio.
Okay.
So you can listen to those emergency broadcasts we mentioned earlier.
Right.
Especially on Sveriges Radio P4.
Got it.
extra batteries, a fully charged power bank for your phone, even a car phone charger are all part of the plan.
I always think it's a good idea to have important phone numbers written down, too.
Yes, definitely.
You never know when technology's going to fail.
Absolutely. That's a smart move.
So we've got water, food, warmth, communication.
Uh-huh.
What else is on the checklist?
Okay, so they recommend having enough cash on hand to last at least a week,
Cash. Okay.
preferably in different denominations.
Interesting. Why the emphasis on cash?
Because in an emergency, those electronic payment systems might not work.
Right.
You might not be able to use your cards or even access your online banking.
So cash is king when the systems go down.
Exactly, yeah.
They also recommend having a first aid kit, basic toiletries, a flashlight, a can opener.
Yep, all the essentials.
It's like anything you might need to be self-sufficient
Yeah.
for a few days without access to any stores or services.
Right, thinking ahead about those everyday essentials that we usually take for granted.
Right, exactly.
One thing that really stood out to me was the level of detail they go into for dealing with sanitation if the water is cut off.
Yeah, that's not something most people would think about right away.
No.
No.
They actually explain how to properly dispose of waste, even if you can't flush your toilet.
Wow.
They recommend having plastic bags, compost litter, even a bucket with a lid.
They've thought of everything.
They really have. It's quite impressive.
But what if things get so bad that people actually need to evacuate their homes?
Okay, so that's covered in the brochure as well.
Okay.
Evacuation orders would be given through channels like that public service announcement system.
Right?
And again, Sveriges Radio P4.
Got it.
They really emphasize listening to the authorities and being ready to leave quickly.
And what about packing a go bag? Any recommendations for that?
Yes, they suggest packing enough food and water for a few days.
Okay.
Essential medications,
Okay.
important documents like ID and insurance information,
Okay.
warm clothing, toiletries, a radio, a phone charger.
So it's like a more portable version of your home preparedness kit.
Exactly.
But what if you're unable to evacuate on your own?
They're very clear that help will be provided and that no one will be left behind.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about like the physical preparation,
Right.
but there's also a whole other layer to this, right?
Yeah, it is.
The psychological defense side of things.
Right, and that's a key part of Sweden's strategy.
Okay.
So the brochure acknowledges that foreign powers might try to manipulate people
Uh-huh.
through disinformation and propaganda,
Yeah.
especially online,
We see that happening more and more these days.
all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they warn about things like fake news,
Okay.
manipulated images and videos,
Right.
content that's designed to stir up strong emotions and sow distrust.
So how do they recommend dealing with that kind of information warfare?
They encourage people to be very mindful of content that triggers a strong emotional reaction,
Okay.
to verify information from multiple sources,
Right.
and to stick to official government channels for news and updates.
So basically, don't believe everything you see on the internet.
Exactly.
Good advice.
They're encouraging people to be skeptical,
Uh-huh.
to question their assumptions, and to really think critically about where information is coming from
Right.
before they share it or react to it.
So they're preparing people for like both physical and digital battlefields in a way.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
They're addressing the full spectrum of threats that a modern society faces.
Yeah.
And, this isn't just about being prepared for war. It's about being resilient
Yeah.
in the face of any kind of disruption or crisis.
Right. They're equipping people with the knowledge and the skills to navigate a world that's becoming increasingly complex and uncertain.
Absolutely.
But speaking of digital threats, they also address the importance of cybersecurity, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
They acknowledge that Sweden's reliance on digital technology also makes them vulnerable to cyber attacks,
Right.
which could cripple essential services
Uh-huh.
or be used to spread misinformation.
Yeah, that's a huge concern these days.
Huge.
So what kind of advice do they give for staying safe online?
So they recommend some basic digital hygiene practices,
Okay.
like creating strong passwords, avoiding suspicious links, installing updates promptly, and backing up important data.
All good practices, even in peacetime.
Absolutely.
Now, what about more serious things like what to do if there's a terror attack?
Okay,
Do
so
they have guidance for that?
they do.
Okay.
They lay out the run, hide, tell protocol,
Okay.
which is a widely recognized strategy for dealing with an active shooter or terrorist attack.
Can you break that down a little? What exactly does that involve?
Okay, so run means trying to escape the danger zone as quickly and safely as possible.
Okay.
Hide means finding a secure place to shelter if you can't escape.
Okay.
So things like locking yourself in a room or barricading a door.
Right.
And tell means calling emergency services as soon as it's safe and reporting what you've seen.
So they must really stress following instructions from the authorities
Absolutely.
in those situations.
Yeah, in a chaotic situation like that, it's crucial to listen to the people who are trained to handle it.
What about if you're in a situation where someone's injured? Do they provide any guidance on, like, basic first aid?
Yes, they have a section on how to stop severe bleeding,
Okay.
which is a skill that could potentially save a life.
Okay, so talk us through that.
Okay, so first, call emergency services immediately.
Okay.
Then apply direct, firm pressure to the wound,
Okay.
preferably using a clean cloth or bandage. Keep your arms extended to maintain pressure.
Right.
And if you get tired, ask someone else to take over.
Okay.
But yeah, so the key is to just keep applying pressure until help arrives.
So don't remove the pressure even if the bleeding seems to have stopped.
Exactly. Not until paramedics tell you it's okay.
That's really good to know.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered war, cyber attacks, terrorism.
Right.
They really are covering all the bases.
They are.
What other kinds of crises does this brochure address?
Well, they also talk about the increasing threat of extreme weather events and natural disasters.
Okay.
So things like heavy rains, floods, heat waves, landslides, and forest fires.
Yeah, with the changing climate, that's becoming a bigger concern everywhere.
It is.
What do they recommend in those cases?
So they really encourage people to find out what the specific risks are in their area
Okay.
and come up with a plan for how to respond to different types of disasters.
So being proactive, not waiting till something happens.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And they recommend having a go bag ready to go in case of evacuation.
Okay, we've covered war, cyber attacks, terrorism, natural disasters. What other potential threats do they cover?
Well, they also discuss the possibility of rapid disease outbreaks
Okay.
and the importance of following guidelines from health authorities.
Something we're all too familiar with in recent years.
All too familiar, exactly.
Yeah.
And they emphasize things like hand washing, vaccination, and social distancing.
Right.
To slow the spread of infectious diseases.
You know, those basic precautions, even when they seem inconvenient, they
Right.
can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. It's about protecting yourself and your community.
Yeah. Exactly, but it's not just about the general population. They also specifically address people with special needs
Yeah.
and how they might need additional support during a crisis.
Right.
So what kind of advice do they give for that?
They encourage people with disabilities or chronic illnesses to talk to their support networks about their needs
Okay.
and to create a plan that takes those needs into account.
Okay.
They also highlight the importance of having a crisis plan
Uh-huh.
that includes information about medications, medical devices, and any other essential supplies.
It's great that they're thinking about those who might need that extra help.
They are.
Yeah.
They even specifically mention that guide dogs and service animals are allowed in civil defense shelters.
Oh, good. Good to know. What about pets?
Oh, they have a section on that too.
Oh.
They recommend having a week's worth of food, water, and any necessary medication for your pets.
Yeah.
Just like for humans.
It makes sense to apply those same principles
Right.
of self-sufficiency to our furry friends.
Abs-
Now, what if you have to evacuate?
Oh,
Can you bring your pet to a shelter?
so they say that pets are allowed in some protective structures.
Yeah.
Like cellars, garages, metro stations,
Mm-hmm.
but not necessarily in all civil defense shelters.
Okay.
So they recommend checking with local authorities for specific guidance.
Okay. And if you can't bring your pet with you,
They advise leaving additional food and water for your pet if it's safe to do so.
so again, doing the best you can to keep them safe.
Right.
Even in a tough situation.
Yeah.
But it's not just about physical safety. They also address kind of the emotional toll these situations can take on people, right?
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
They have a whole section on managing anxiety and talking to children about war.
Those are such important topics
They are.
that don't always get enough attention in these kinds of discussions.
No, they don't.
So what kind of advice do they give?
Well, they encourage people to talk about their feelings.
Okay.
Whether it's with friends, family, or a professional. And to engage in activities that promote well-being.
Okay.
like
Yeah.
exercise, spending time in nature, or relaxation techniques.
So taking care of mental health as well as physical safety.
Exactly.
And they remind people that it's okay to seek professional help if
Right.
they need it.
Yeah.
And they also offer advice on how to talk to children about war,
Uh,
which is a really tough conversation to have.
it is.
They suggest explaining the situation in an age-appropriate way,
Right.
listening to their concerns,
Yeah.
and focusing on activities that provide comfort.
It sounds like they're really trying to be sensitive to the fact that these events can be very traumatic,
Yeah.
especially for kids.
Yeah, they emphasize the importance of limiting children's exposure to news and media coverage,
Right.
which can be really overwhelming.
Absolutely.
Wow, they've really thought this through, haven't they?
They have.
It's not just addressing the logistics,
Right.
they're acknowledging the human side of these crises.
I think that's one of the most impressive things about this brochure.
Yeah.
They've clearly put a lot of thought and care into providing their citizens with really comprehensive guidance on how to prepare for and navigate a wide range of potential threats.
It's really, really insightful.
It is.
You know, I have to admit, now I'm wondering what a preparedness brochure for my own country would look like.
That is a fascinating thought.
It is.
Isn't it?
It really is. We've covered a lot of ground here, but there's still more to explore.
Yeah, definitely.
We'll be right back after a short break to delve deeper into some of the key takeaways from all this and what it all means in the grand scheme of things.
Sounds good. Welcome back.
You know, as we're going through this Swedish preparedness brochure, I'm struck by how seriously they're taking these potential threats.
Right.
But it doesn't feel like fear-mongering.
No.
It's got a very matter-of-fact tone to it.
Yeah.
Almost like, hey, this is the reality we live in. Let's get prepared together.
Right, exactly.
Not panicky, just practical.
Yeah. And it's interesting how much they emphasize individual responsibility.
Yeah.
They're not just relying on the government to handle everything.
Yeah.
They're really empowering their citizens to play an active role in their own safety and the well-being of their communities.
It's that whole total defense concept, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Where everyone has a part to play.
Everyone.
No matter who you are or what your background is.
Right.
It makes me wonder, do you think this kind of approach could work in other countries? Or is it uniquely suited to, Swedish culture?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
There's definitely a strong sense of community and social responsibility in Sweden, which I think makes this type of approach more effective.
Yeah.
But I do think there are elements of it that could be adapted to other contexts.
Like what, specifically?
Well, for starters, the idea of having a plan.
Okay.
That's something that everyone, regardless of where they live, can benefit from.
Right.
Knowing what to do in different types of emergencies, having supplies on hand.
Right.
Those are just good common sense practices.
I suppose that's true even on a smaller scale.
Yeah.
Having a plan for your household in case of a power outage or a natural disaster.
Absolutely.
It's not always about, prepping for doomsday.
Right.
It's about being prepared for any kind of disruption.
Exactly. And the brochure goes beyond just the physical preparations, too.
Yeah.
Which I think is really important. They really highlight the psychological aspects of preparedness as well.
That section on psychological defense was fascinating. It's like they're acknowledging that information warfare is a whole other battleground these days.
Exactly. And they're not shying away from the fact that these kinds of threats can be just as damaging as physical attacks.
Right.
They're giving people tools to navigate that landscape.
Right.
To critically evaluate information and not just fall prey to propaganda or disinformation.
It's like they're trying to create a culture of critical thinking, almost like a national defense mechanism against manipulation.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
They're essentially saying, don't just take things at face value, question what you see and hear.
Right.
Especially online.
Which is good advice for all of us, really.
Absolutely.
In this age of information overload and deepfakes.
All the time.
So let's talk about some of the more specific recommendations from the brochure that really stood out to you.
Yeah.
What were some of the things that you found particularly insightful?
Well, first of all, I have to say I was impressed by just how practical and detailed their advice is.
Okay.
They're not just saying be prepared. They're giving you step-by-step instructions for things like storing water, finding shelter,
Right.
even how to dispose of waste if the sewage system isn't working.
It's those little details that really bring it to life, don't they?
They do. It's not just abstract concepts. It's about real-world scenarios
Yeah.
that people might actually face.
Exactly, and it's clear they've put a lot of thought into it.
Yeah.
For example, I love the tip about storing water in the freezer.
Oh, yeah, that's great.
Such a simple but clever solution
Yeah.
for both space saving and having a backup source of clean water.
Yeah, it's so practical.
And speaking of practical, I thought the advice on having cash on hand was really interesting.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Something most people probably wouldn't think about until it's too late.
Absolutely. We're so used to relying on electronic payments these days.
Right.
But in a real emergency, those systems could easily go down.
Right.
Having some cash tucked away could be essential.
It's a good reminder to think about those things we usually take for granted
Right.
and how they might not be available in a crisis.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, what really impressed me was their emphasis on community resilience.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just about individual preparedness.
Yeah.
It's about working together and supporting each other.
I thought that was a really strong message.
Yeah.
They're encouraging people to get to know their neighbors, to volunteer in their communities, to think about how they can help those who might need extra assistance.
It's about creating a sense of solidarity and collective responsibility.
Exactly.
Which is something that's arguably more important than ever.
It is.
In a world that often feels increasingly divided and polarized.
Absolutely. This brochure is a reminder that in times of crisis, we're all in this together.
Yeah.
And that's a powerful message.
It is. It is. And it's not just about the big picture stuff either.
Right.
They also address some really specific concerns, like how to take care of pets in an emergency, or how to talk to children about these really difficult topics.
I thought that was a really thoughtful inclusion.
Yeah.
They're acknowledging that these events can be traumatic, especially for children.
Right.
And they're giving parents and caregivers tools to help them navigate those conversations.
It's about providing emotional support as well as practical guidance.
It is.
Which I think is so crucial in these situations.
Absolutely. And it all comes back to that idea of fostering resilience, not just as individuals, but as communities and as a nation.
And that resilience extends beyond just physical preparedness.
Right.
It includes digital security too, right?
Absolutely. They dedicate a good chunk of the brochure to talking about cybersecurity.
Yeah.
And the importance of protecting yourself online.
It's a really important message, especially given how interconnected our lives are these days.
It is.
Yeah.
Cyber attacks can be just as disruptive as physical attacks.
Right.
If not more so in some cases.
And it's not just about protecting, like, government systems or critical infrastructure. It's about individual responsibility, too.
Right.
Things like strong passwords, being aware of phishing scams. Those are all things that everyone can do to improve their own digital security.
Exactly. And they even talk about the importance of backing up your data,
Right.
which is something that most people probably don't think about until it's too late.
Right.
But in an emergency, having access to your important files and documents could be crucial.
It's interesting how they weave digital security into this broader concept of preparedness.
Yeah, it's all connected.
It's not just a separate issue.
No, it's all part of the same picture.
So what we're talking about here is a holistic approach to preparedness.
I think so.
It's not just about stocking up on supplies or learning how to use a fire extinguisher.
Right.
It's about taking a comprehensive view of the threats we face and building resilience on all levels.
Exactly. And I think that's the real lesson here.
Okay.
Preparedness is not just about surviving a specific event. It's about building a society that can adapt and thrive in the face of whatever challenges come our way.
Well said.
Thank you.
This brochure is a fascinating glimpse into how Sweden is approaching that challenge.
It is.
And it raises some interesting questions about how other countries might adapt those lessons to their own unique circumstances.
Yeah.
But before we get into that, we need to take a quick break. We'll be right back to explore the broader implications of this Swedish preparedness campaign, what it might tell us about the changing global landscape. This whole deep dive into this Swedish preparedness brochure, it's really got me thinking.
Yeah. In what way?
Well, on the one hand, it's just so impressive.
Right.
How comprehensive it is and so practical, like they've really thought of everything.
Yeah, I agree. Very thorough.
But it just makes you wonder, what would a preparedness brochure for, our own country look like?
Yeah.
Would it be this detailed? Would it address, like, the same kind of threats?
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
One of the things that struck me about the Swedish approach is the level of transparency.
Right. They're not sugarcoating anything.
No, yeah.
They're like laying out the potential risks, even the really scary ones, in a very straightforward way.
Exactly. It's almost like they're saying, look, we're not going to pretend that everything is fine.
Right.
There are real threats out there, and we need to be prepared for them.
But it's not just about, like, scaring people.
Right.
It's about empowering them, too.
I think that's key.
Yeah.
By being upfront about the risks, they're giving people the information they need to make their own decisions about how to prepare.
It's like they're saying, we trust you to handle this information responsibly.
Yeah.
We're all in this together.
That sense of trust is really important.
Yeah.
It creates a sense of shared responsibility, which I think is essential for building a resilient society.
Now, zooming out a bit, do you think that this Swedish preparedness campaign tells us anything about, like, the broader global landscape?
I think it reflects this growing awareness that the threats that we face in the 21st century are more complex and interconnected than ever before.
It's not just about, like, traditional military conflicts anymore, right?
Exactly. It's about cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, climate change, pandemics, all these things that can destabilize a country just as effectively as a conventional war.
So it's like a recognition that the world is just becoming more volatile and unpredictable.
And that governments need to adapt.
Right.
And this Swedish brochure, I think, is a good example of how they're starting to do that.
By being more proactive and transparent.
Right.
And more engaged with their citizens.
Exactly. They're recognizing that they can't handle these challenges alone.
Right.
They need the active participation of their people.
So it's not just about, like, top-down directives.
Right.
It's about fostering, like, a bottom-up culture of preparedness.
Exactly. It's about empowering individuals to take responsibility for their own safety and the well-being of their communities.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway that you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think it's this. Knowledge is power.
Okay.
The more we understand about the threats that we face, the better equipped we'll be to deal with them.
I like that.
And this Swedish brochure is a great example of how to provide that knowledge in a clear, concise, and actionable way.
And for anyone listening who wants to check out the full brochure, you can find it online in multiple languages.
Oh, great.
Just search for Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency or MSB.
Awesome.
It's definitely worth a read, even if you don't live in Sweden.
There's a lot we can all learn from their approach.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this one final thought.
Okay.
What would a preparedness brochure for your own country look like?
Yeah.
What threats would it address? What advice would it offer?
Good question.
It's something to ponder.
Food for thought.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.